Thank you very much for having me this morning. It's a real privilege to be here. And thank the university. I mean, we've been so well treated. It's been a wonderful experience already. And it's also, I suppose, for a unionist, an opportunity that I think hasn't been all that available in the past. Probably more because of unionists than anyone else, because unionists were actually, for a time, reluctant to go either to the south of Ireland or go to America. Now some did, but there was a certain reluctance, and I think there was a feeling that nobody understands us. And there was also a feeling that there was sort of a plot to undermine us and all that type of thing. I'm also, by the way, going to talk more in Matt's sort of approach from a personal point of view, because that's what I know, not just a personal point of view, but what my own experience is. And it has been a long road. The emphasis on the long road is because for me, the troubles began, or the impetus to the troubles began much earlier than '69, which I'll try to illustrate. First of all, I was born and reared on the Shankill Road, which is, actually, as I was growing up, it was seen as the heart of the empire, believe it or not, this road. And Gusty Spence actually, he's good at drawing illustrations of what it means for people. And he drew an illustration. He said a young fella a wee boy, he hadn't got a seat in his trousers. He was in poverty, and he's looking at a map of the world, and there's a whole lot of red bits on it. You know, Australia, Canada, India. You know, all these parts of the British Empire. And he said to his mate, "We own all that." You know, he'd nothing, but we own the empire. And in a sense, identifying with that empire. And coming from the Shankill was a great pride. Actually, there was a mixture of pride and almost shame, because the Shankill Road had a bad reputation, always had a reputation of a place where people fought and where there was trouble and so on. But actually I grew up there and never had any problem at all. I mean, it was one of those things. There was fighting, but it was sort of like controlled fighting. On that road, I was born up at the top of the road. The roads on the left go straight to the Falls Road, and as I was growing up, you could go to the Falls Road. There was no pace line, there was no barriers. But when I went down there, we knew that we were in enemy territory. I'm talking about going right back to certainly the early 50s, maybe even the 40s. And we would go to the Falls Road to go to the swimming baths, because they had better swimming baths than we had. Swimming baths were down at the bottom of the road in Peters Hill, and they weren't very good, so we went to the Falls Road. But when we went there, if you had, as Gusty Spence would have had a picture of the Union Jack or something, some Loyalist slogans on his arm, he would cover it with a plaster so that nobody could see it. But the Catholics always wore their, in those days, their St. Christophers. So you knew who was a Catholic and who was not a Catholic. And you were always afraid of being asked the question, "What are you?" Which meant, are you a Protestant or Catholic? And if you said the wrong thing, you were in trouble. And that happened in both areas. But I lived in that community. It was a Protestant community. And even if you did talk to anyone outside that community, you never talked about the things that divided you. So you didn't really understand. You weren't taught Irish history. You knew nothing about the background. You knew nothing about what the IRA represented. I've done a lot of thinking about how I got to where I got to and came through all this. And it was a long and difficult journey. One of the things in my home on the Shankill Road was this picture. It's a picture of Dan Winter's cottage where the Orange Order was founded in 1795, but the picture I think is 1895. My father pointed to the picture and said, "One of your ancestors is one of those men. He was a founder member of the Orange Order." And it was years later that I looked closely at this, and there's the man on the left has got a gun, the man on the right just past the door's got a gun, and the other man here's got a gun, and there's a man on the horse that you can hardly see has got guns. So there was always that defensive mentality within the Unionist community that somehow we're under threat. But that, I didn't know anything about the Orange Order, but it obviously encouraged a certain fascination. But Derry, our two friends here are both from Derry. Derry always played a big part in my background and understanding because the stories of the relief of Derry. This is an orange banner depicting the Protestants behind the walls living on rats and cats and mice and dogs, which you actually paid for a matter of pence for a mouse, a few shillings for a dog to eat. when they were starving. And that was sort of like, I suppose for the Unionist community, that was like equivalent to the Irish famine. That was our struggle. And it was an iconic thing that I grew up with. And the siege mentality that I'm sure you've heard about is something which was part of us and is still part of us. And if you don't understand the siege mentality, you can't understand Unionists. But I was this. I'm trying to convey to you where I came from and what it meant, and that would be typical of not all Protestants, but most of them. I had a children's Bible, quite a big thing, but this thick, a large Bible, and in that Bible, which I pored over as a young child, there was these pictures, and these are two of the pictures, and there are others that I identified with. And it's all about suffering and about persecution. On the left-hand side is Daniel in the lion's den because he refused to bow down to Nebuchadnezzar. On the right-hand side is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. If you know who those people are, you've read your Bible. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were in a similar position, and they were put into the burning fiery furnace and suffered there. And as people looked on, there was another figure there which is believed to have been Christ. But it's the idea of suffering for your faith. And I grew up with a very strong identity with Daniel and with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And we were always told selective history. And we were told about the persecution of the Protestant by the Catholic Church. Those like Latimer and Ridley, who died at the stake in England. When I was in Oxford, I remember seeing the spot. It was in Oxford, I think they were actually burned at the stake. And I saw a cross in the road with the spot where they were actually burned to death. And there was a great feeling of sort of identity with those people that was part of me. The thing was, what it meant to me was that I was absolutely determined to stand for what I saw as the faith and the truth, come what may. And my father had become an evangelical Christian. Actually, he was a member of a church which is based in Anderson, Indiana, but had a branch in Belfast, which I'll mention again later. I was brought up in an evangelical world. This church here, which I went to as a child, that's my two children on it, but I went there as a child, and lots of other mission halls. It was built by Amy Carmichael. Anybody heard of the word Amy Carmichael? No? Amy Carmichael was an evangelical Christian who built this church for the mill workers. My mother was a mill worker. My father, by the way, left school when he was 12. This sounds incredible. I still find it incredible. My mother when she was 13, but she was already working in the mills part-time from she was about 10, and she was working the mill from something like 6 o'clock in the morning to 6:30 at night, with just short breaks for breakfast and so on. But Amy Carmichael built this for the mill workers who didn't have the clothes, because if you went to church in those days on the Sunday, you had to be dressed up in good clothes. So if you didn't have the good clothes, you went somewhere else where you could go in your duds sort of thing. But I was brought up and absolutely immersed in that world. But it was in 1955, but there's an awful lot of American connections in my life as well. Jack Shuler was a preacher from America. I think he died when he was only about 49, quite young. He had a crusade in Belfast, and I decided, he said, if you're not sure you're a Christian, you're probably not a Christian, and I wanted to be a Christian. And I asked my mother, what does it mean to be saved? And she says, it means you don't go to hell, you go to heaven. And from what I'd heard about hell, it didn't sound very nice, so I wanted to go to heaven. So, but I wasn't sure whether I was saved or not. So Jack Shuler preaching, and I decided, he actually said, if you're not sure, you're not saved. So I went forward and committed my life to Christ. He was sort of Billy Graham figure. But he had another meeting asking people to commit their lives to Christ. And he actually said, that might not be exactly the words, even if the Red Army is marching through the Belfast streets, are you prepared to stand for Christ? Now, and that was the days of the Cold War. That was actually 1955. And I made my commitment. The communist threat was very, very important, even later on, to stand for Christ. So this was reinforcing almost the sort of siege mentality. Now, the little church that I attended, this is a picture of the church in 1960. And that's me on the left-hand side. And the fellow to the right of me is an American preacher who came over and visited us. And he actually said to me, someday you'll come over, I'll see you in America. And I said, it seemed out of my world, I'll never be in America. So I'm here, so he was right. My father's there, my mother's there, and so on. But the little church is the Church of God Reformation movement based in Anderson, Indiana here. So it's, and the lady, I should have a pointer, but just near the front there with the hat, a nice smile, she was an American missionary, Naomi Allen, who was trying to convert the poor Irish. But the important point about this was, and this is where I was brought up in this evangelical world, and I'd forgotten most of the stories about the siege of Derry and all that. I mean, it wasn't very much in my thinking. We had a preacher in 1956 who told us two things. Number one, the Protestant faith is dying out in Ireland. And number two, the IRA had gone communist. Now, that frightened the life out of me, and that's what... I was only a young boy at the time, a teenager, and that was my first interest in politics, because you needed politics to secure your position. Because if Protestantism died out, we associated Protestantism with freedom, with the right to be who you are. I mean, both communities are very much into freedom and rights in a sense, and the centre of the Orange Order. The idea that the IRA has gone communist at that stage is wrong. But, I mean, I was speaking at a meeting very recently, and a fellow called Mick Ryan, who was one of the leading IRA men of the time, he says we weren't communists, we were still doing our rosaries in those days. That was in 1956 when this preacher said this. But at that time, the leader of the IRA, Cathal Golding, was in prison in England, or had been in prison, and he was reading communist literature, and he was certainly interested in that. And there were people talking about that sort of radical thinking. Now, that's crucial, because everything that happened subsequent to this was interpreted in the light of the communist threat. And the IRA was seen in that. Now, it was exaggerated, but there was a threat for... I mean, I know Roy Johnson was the sort of brains behind. He had been brought into the IRA to do the thinking. The funny thing is, Roy Johnson ended up as a Quaker, and I attended Quaker meetings for many, many years. And it was through the Quakers that I met Roy Johnson. But Roy Johnson was from a Protestant background in Dungannon, but he had attended some communist meetings, so he was labelled a communist. He would say he was a democratic socialist, and he wanted change, and he wanted fairness and all that sort of thing. But he told me in later years that the idea was to take the gun out of politics in Ireland. But we didn't know that. We just saw this as a communist threat. A communist threat meant Moscow. This meant, well, you know all about it. That was the days of the Cold War. It was here, you know, McCarthyism, all that sort of thing. So that was my introduction to politics. Immediately after that photograph, I went to a Bible college in England called All Nations Bible College. It's now called All Nations Christian College. And I spent 2 years there, full-time, lived in, and it opened my mind, coming from the back streets of Belfast. I left school at the age of 14 with no education, really. This is my education. And although it didn't immediately free me from some of the prejudice, it did give me a different worldview, which was important later on. Immediately after I come back, and this is where my real politics began to develop, I came back in 1962, which is the anniversary of the Ulster Covenant. Now, the Ulster Covenant was signed by almost all the Protestant, and my understanding is some Catholics as well, signed it to remain British, whatever, you know, that our civil and religious liberty, our economic welfare, and whatever was important, that we remain British. There's a site you can look up and see who signed the covenant, and I looked up, and my relatives, because my family came originally from Monaghan, on the other side of the border, everybody, men and women, to a man and to a woman, all signed this covenant. Now, I'd know nothing about it until 1962, and at this big demonstration, and typical of Unionists, they wanted to show they were more loyal to Britain than anybody else. So the big flag illustrates that. You can see the size of that flag. There's a man on the left and a man on top. It's about the size of this room, maybe bigger, a massive, massive flag. And at this big demonstration, which was an education for me. So it was bringing me back to why my ancestors had signed the covenant and what they were afraid of and all that sort of thing. And also it told the story of the gun running. So it's helped to legitimise gun running. This was organised by a committee of Unionists and Orange men and so on. Also, 2 years later, I took part in a service, and I think this is quite incredible. Well, you can read it there and see what it is, but it's a service, a religious service in the Free Presbyterian Church. I'd started attending the Free Presbyterian Church around this period. 1964 is the 50th anniversary of 1914, when the guns were brought into Larne and Donaghadee and places like that. And I discovered in more recent times that some of my relatives were actually training the UVF and distributing the guns. So the point with this was in a religious service. As I was growing up in some of those mission halls, they saw politics as, my father told me, politics is a dirty game. You don't want to be involved in politics, it's dirty. And they almost regarded you couldn't be a Christian and be an Orange man, never mind being a Unionist. There was a whole problem with that. But this was bringing the two things together. It was actually a service of thanksgiving for the guns. Now, the way Ian Paisley would have seen it was, of course, that this is a struggle against the people of God. Yeah, you'll not hear much of this, but this is part of the early struggle. And if you don't understand it, you don't understand what happened. As I say, the following year, that's 1964, but 1965, the UVF had been formed, and that was the downward slope into the violence. In that same year, later that same year, there was the first riots in Belfast, which actually served to us to confirm that all the prophecies that we'd heard from the preacher and from Ian Paisley about the trouble that was coming, that we had been sold out and all that sort of thing, was confirmed. Now, it was a crazy thing, because the reason for the riots was because this man, Liam McMillan, or Billy McMillan, as we knew him, was standing for election. Now, Billy McMillan was the leader of the IRA in Belfast, and he had a tricolour in the window. It's important. The problem is I could go on all day trying to explain all the different things, because it's all very complex. The tricolour represents green for the Nationalists, orange for the Protestants, and white for peace in between. It's quite a radical message, peace for everybody. But we saw it as, in fact, many Republicans saw it the same, as green, white, and yellow. And I was told what those colours meant was white and yellow were the colours of the Vatican, and green for Ireland. So you can see what it means. And it was also seen as a flag of aggression. The IRA was fighting for this flag, and that was the flag they used. So it was frightening. Ian Paisley threatened to take the flag out of the window of his offices. And because of that, riots blew up, and there was the first riots, water cannons on the street. This was in 1964. I saw the riots because I passed close by and was able to see them. Inside, just quickly, the poem that Billy McMillan has, because the old official IRA was trying to move into a more non-sectarian approach. And he's quoting a poem by a Presbyterian which says, "And let the orange lily be your badge, my patriot brother. It's the everlasting green for me and us for one another." So he was trying to take the true message of the tricolour. 2 years later, a massive big demonstration by Nationalists on the Falls Road. I'm very Belfast oriented, of course. But it was led by Betty Sinclair. Betty Sinclair was a well-known communist, a member of the Communist Party. Now, she was a good woman, did a lot of good work. But for us, again, this was Moscow, and this proved that the IRA was communist. And Ian Paisley had this demonstration in opposition. You can see just a rough glance. There was thousands in his parade and thousands upon thousands in the Nationalist parade. There was all sorts of rumours about revolution, that the IRA was going to take over the City Hall, and all sorts of things. They were going to cause a revolution. So this was galvanising us. This is 66, before the Troubles were said to have started, though the first killings took place in 1966, and which Gusty Spence was imprisoned for. Another thing just happened, which was again helped to reinforce this idea of revolution, was I was in the Shankill Road, and this newspaper blew into a store that I had and landed at my feet. And I looked at it and I saw the name Sean Garland, and I read it, and it was his thinking. Now, in those days, I saw it as the army of the revolution stands idly by. This is revolution. It's the IRA ready to take over. But when you read it, what he was trying to do was lead the IRA in those days away from violence to, and not to stimulate sectarian violence. Anyway, the result of all that was I joined the Young Unionist and the Orange Order. In the middle figure there, if you know Northern Ireland very well, you would recognise, it's a young Reg MP. On his right, over this side of the back, is Lord John Laird. Clifford Smith's down here on the right. He's an Orange commentator, and I'm over on the left. I became a leading young Unionist and a leading member of the Orange Order. Well, maybe not a leading member, but it was certainly very prominent. Because of all the background to defend Ulster, there's me protesting against O'Neill, who was seen as he saw the problem. He was trying to open things up, and we were protesting. I told him, I stood about as close as I am to Bonnie here in front of O'Neill one day, and I said, "You're the destroyer of Ulster." And I then became very active and a leading figure in this. And this is me in the middle and the left-hand side here, proposing a resolution that we be masters in our own house and not bring in reforms, because we saw reforms as revolutionary, not reform, if you see what I mean. And we believe that the British government was colluding with the IRA and the Irish sort of thing to try and force us into United Ireland, which United Ireland to us meant domination by the Catholic Church. In those days the Irish Constitution laid claim to us. The Catholic Church had a special position in the Constitution, all sorts of complicated things. So we were prepared to resist that. And 1 year later, I proposed a resolution. This is from some of my documents, which was described as a call to arms. We proposed a resolution that we resist any political solution. Because in our view, and in fact in the view of many of the establishment as well, the IRA had to be defeated, not negotiated with. So we were saying, propose this, but it was seen as a call to arms, and in fact we were organising a paramilitary group. And largely through my own contacts, I knew a leading figure in the UVF, and I told him what we were doing, and he said, "We'll come in with you." And so I was involved, one of the leading figures in this paramilitary group, with the UVF inside it. So in a sense, the critics of us were right. We were promoting resistance, armed resistance. But in the middle of this, it was a crucial, this is crucially important. The UVF, as Matt said, one of the leading figures in the UVF was, his boss was a very good friend of mine. He was, I think, the intelligence officer of the UVF, and Billy Mitchell was very close to me. Always talked about Billy Mitchell. But in the middle of all this, for a whole lot of reasons, I had come to the conclusion that some of the unionists that I was with, now this doesn't apply to everybody, but some of the unionists, the more extreme element who actually helped to cause the trouble, believed in a Protestant ascendancy. And I heard them talking about this, and I was aghast, because to me, I believe in a democracy. I believe in everybody having the right to do what they are, but they believe in an ascendancy. That set alarm bells in my head. Second thing was to refer to Loyalists as cannon fodder. They were going to direct operations, and that, because I was from a Loyalist background, I rejected that. I was launched in a whole process of rethinking everything, and it took my life in my hands. But I ended up going to, for example, Queen's University. I started studying, was leading up the university, and met John Morrow there, who was a leader of Corrymeela, and it was a great release to begin to think about things in a wider context. I took serious risks, and I was told to keep my head down, keep out of things, which I did. In 1979, I committed myself publicly to peace. I was introduced by this friend of mine, who was an intelligence officer in the UVF, to Gusty Spence when he came out of jail. And we worked very closely together, coming right up to the Good Friday Agreement. I know my time's gone out, so I'm rushing through this. So, sort of things that we ended up involved in. This was a meeting in Rostrevor in County Down. On the left, there's two Bosnian refugees, wounded refugees from Bosnia. It's myself in the middle, and then a leading member of Sinn Féin, Francie Malloy. The present President of Ireland on his right, our right, and then Tommy Sands, who's a singer, and Peter Emerson, who's done an awful lot of peace work. Got involved in all this sort of work, went to the Forum for Peace and Reconciliation, as I think Bunny said, and was disciplined for the Unionist Party for going, because they saw it as Gerry Adams' forum. This is a Roman Catholic sister with me at an orange tattoo in Belfast, along with two IRA people, a husband and wife who were both IRA. But out of that, her brother, Jim Lynch, who'd been in the IRA. He died. And believe it or not, Gusty Spence and I went to the funeral. And believe it or not, that's Gusty Spence giving an oration at the funeral of an IRA man. I find that quite incredible. I was with him. I went to the Catholic Church, stood at beside the grave, and I think it was a brother of the man who died. He said to Gusty, "Would you say a few words?" So this is Gusty speaking. Actually, only Gusty could have got away with that because he was highly respected. Just quickly, in 1995, I was asked to share a platform with Martin McGuinness. Actually, it was Martin McGuinness, Mark Durkin, Albert Reynolds, and Ken Newell. And the point about it was Loyalists supported me in doing all those things. Loyalists have not got the credit for the positive things they did. They were in the middle of this conflict. They were shooting, they were killing, they were dying. I got a message before I went on to this, when I was doing a TV interview, saying two things. A message from David Irvine, the leader of the PUP, which is linked to the UVF, and the leader of the UVF, congratulating me and supporting me in doing this, whereas Unionists were opposing everything I did. There's another picture. I was disciplined for this as well. I went to an opening of the Sinn Féin office, and they disciplined me for talking to Gerry Adams. And I said, "Look, I was only at this office. I didn't know Gerry Adams was going to be there." And they said, "Albert, look, you're smiling."
I'm actually looking at him right.
This is Billy Mitchell, the fellow that Mark mentioned, on the right, Gerry Adams on the left. And Billy did a powerful amount of work. This is in the New Lloyd's Road Festival. One of the things he said to Gerry Adams, "Sure, you must be an Ulster Scot with a name like Adams." And he stood up and he says, "No, I'm Irish, Scots-Irish. I'm Scots-Irish, not Ulster Scots." Same thing. I'm right at the end of this. On the Good Friday Agreement, I've been through all this, and through the help of Gary McMichael over here, I was to go up to the Stormont estate, and the Ian Paisley supporters had blocked all the entrances. But I heard there was one way in, so I was walking up towards us, crowds and crowds of people, and I saw Gary McMichael, who was a negotiator, so he had the right to be in there. And I called him, and he brought me to the car, brought me into the grounds. I get into the grounds, and who comes out at the front door? Billy Mitchell and Anne Carr of the Women's Coalition. They called me over, and I got into the building where the Good Friday Agreement was reached. I was the only non-negotiator, and I was free to wander around. But just an illustration, I was in the Sinn Féin room. They weren't looking too happy. Things weren't going well. I was in the Alliance room, the Women's Coalition, the Loyalists, and I decided, I'm going to the Unionist room. I'm a Unionist. And I sat down there, and the negotiations were going on, and John Taylor was in giving a report. And somebody pointed at me and said, "What's he doing here?" So I beat a hasty retreat. Now, I left. It wasn't thrown out, but it was virtually thrown out. But it was a wonderful experience just to be there and mix with everybody through that. I have to tell you this story. I know time's almost gone. In the course of writing, I think it was when I wrote the book about Gusty Spence, I'm not just sure now, I got an interview with Martin Meehan. Now, Martin Meehan was a top Republican, a hard man. And I was talking to him, and he told me that his grandfather died in the First World War in France. And I told Gusty Spence that Martin had said this. They knew each other. And Gusty Spence, the next time I saw Gusty Spence, he had all these papers, the grave, the name, because Martin had got his grandfather's name wrong. He called him Cornelius. It was Camillus. But I presented this to Martin Meehan. And this is Martin Meehan in France pointing to his grandfather's name on the memorial in France, which was a wonderful experience. And for him, it was a very moving thing. Again, it's the politics, the personal thing between he and I and Gusty Spence that changed things. And the last thing that Martin did, he died quite recently. He said to me, could we get Gusty to go with him to do a television program in France together? But Gusty, he's older than Martin was even, and he's not that well. He didn't do it, which was rather sad. Just a slightly hesitant note, because just to illustrate, there is a cause for this. The poster on the left was at the end of my street. That was about 1996. Roy Garland is a traitor to the people of Drumbeg and Ulster. Now, that's one of my prized possessions now, but at the time, it really was, there was threats from Unionists who saw this as we were making peace with Republicans who were terrorists, who were the enemy, and we were selling out. And the right-hand side is representing the year, you would know all about this from Derry, the burning of Lundy, who was seen as a traitor in the siege of Derry. So what they were saying to me was, you have to watch yourself. And it was serious. My name and Gusty Spence's and others appeared in the leaflet of the Loyalist Volunteer Force, which was a breakaway, a right-wing breakaway from the UVF. So I've rushed through the last stuff, but I've tried to sort of touch on things, maybe we'll touch on later, how individuals are very, very important, and the relationships that are established to bring about change. And it has been actually, for me, a wonderful experience to get to know Republicans, because one of the first things I discovered was they're just like us. They live almost side by side.
Don't stretch it too far, Roy, okay?
But I mean, it's the same background. I worked in the Royal Victoria Hospital in the Falls Road when I was a student. I went to university late, and I worked with them, and they were just like us. And they're the same sort of lifestyle. Well, mostly was revolved around the pub and the bookies. But it was very important to discover that, and to find that everybody's, we all have our stories. And if we work together and respect each other, there's a future. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we'll take 15 minutes for questions, and I think Roy reminded me at the end that one of the reasons that I'm happy that these three men are all together is because they are quite free. I think Roy illustrates that perhaps most starkly of party political agendas or any sort of constraint that they might be under if they belonged to a more active group that whose purview they were under. So it's nice that they can have this open a conversation, and actually I think quite not necessarily typical. So I'd like to open it up to the floor, and anybody who has a question for any of the speakers.
And Bonnie, will you have them wait for the microphone to come since this is being
Yes. Is it? Is somebody carrying a mic? Oh, okay. Okay. So.
Questions for Matt. Matt, you were talking, I think you said your father was rejected from some jobs, and they put RC on, Roman Catholic, and you said you were marginalized as a Catholic and repressed. Could you go into some detail and describe your marginalization and being repressed within that society?
Well, I told you earlier on that we lived in an extended family situation. So actually, I grew up in a household where there was 4 adults, and only one person in the household actually had a vote in the elections at that particular point in time. And in stark contrast, and this was part of a gerrymander, and actually Derry, where Kevin and I come from, is actually the grossest example of political gerrymandering probably in the face of the earth. But the reality is that as part of that gerrymander, a unionist property owner could have as many as 40 votes. So even though within the confines of Derry City, the unionist population was in a minority, they actually controlled the city council. Now, here in the United States, it really doesn't matter that, well, we might debate this point. I don't think it's horrendous either way, whether it's the Republican Party or the Democratic Party control a city council, because the politics is not exclusionary. But for us, what it meant is that we didn't get jobs in our own city. And it meant that my parent, my father, was, and the nearest analogy you can think of is the Mexican migrant laborers that come across the border to work in the agricultural industry for a pittance. Well, my father had to go to England, Scotland, Wales, Holland, Luxembourg, Belgium, And he was gone a lot when we were growing up. So really and truly, there's many things I could say, but I think the greatest thing I could say on a personal note is discrimination robbed us of our father's presence for a good portion of our growing up.
Could I just say a wee bit that the same rules applied to the Unionist community as to the Nationalist community? My father had actually 3 votes, believe it or not.
Right.
But it was because he had 2 wee shops, and there were hucksters of wee shops
Right.
in the Old Lodge Road in Belfast. And my mother had no vote. And we'd no, you know, it was the householder, sorry, he had a vote for the house and he had a vote for the 2 properties. Everybody was the same. If you had a property, I knew a Catholic who had 13 votes because he had businesses. So it applied right across the board, and it applied in England, but only up to 1945 or something,
Right.
and it was abolished. I mean, it was wrong, but you know what I mean? It did apply across the board.
Well, can I just on that point respond that you're telling the truth. You're absolutely correct. However, really a decision was made to disenfranchise, because there were Protestants who were disenfranchised,
Yeah.
but the Protestants were disenfranchised for the greater good of a repressive Unionist statelet. So they were sacrificial lambs to make sure that the greater the greater element was protected, i.e. that the state would continue about the business of repression.
The gentleman with the tie.
Gentlemen, you all brought us up to your point to where the Good Friday Agreement was reached. And obviously, that was a great moment. But as today, more than 10 years later, we don't have a Bill of Rights. There's cogs in it, such as the United Ireland, and it appears to an outsider that things have stalled. And obviously, Roy and Kevin still in the North of Ireland, and Matt, with your ties there, can you guys each touch briefly on the progress with the Good Friday Agreement since the signing, specifically with the Bill of Rights and United Ireland?
Yeah, can I just take that very quickly? That's one of the points I tried to make in my contribution, because I think you're right. I think you're right that the situation to a certain extent has stalled. Now, it's certainly better than what it was, and nobody wants ever to go back to what it was. And I don't think there's any great belief that we ever will go back to where we were. But you're dead right. The situation has stalled. It may well be that the Good Friday Agreement, as it was negotiated and agreed in 1998, is maybe now starting to reach the end of its natural life. And maybe it's time now to look to the next stage and see how we can bring it on from the Good Friday Agreement. So I think that's a very valid point.
I think you're right. I mean, clearly, even a superficial examination of the Good Friday Accord realizes it's just one point on the continuum. And actually, it kind of points up something that I said in the course of my presentation. It's about stasis is our worst enemy. Stasis is our worst enemy, and really, it's going to require a great deal of energy to make things roll forward. And rather interestingly, one of the things that I didn't address was the American support base for the Republican movement here. And the American support base actually is demonstrative of a form of stasis, because what they did was they were told that the peace process had begun, the war was over, and everything was going to be hunky-dory, and we're going to all ride off into the sunset together. And of course, that's not reflective of reality at all. But what it has meant is that, to a large measure, the Irish support base has now closed its eyes and is not looking in the direction of the North to promote change. Now, maybe, just maybe, because of a homegrown issue over, the situation of Irish Republican prisoners, eyes are starting to open again. But the reality is, it's only a point. The Good Friday Accord is only a point in a continuum, right?
Yeah, well, I would say it's a very dramatic point, very important point.
Mm-hmm.
Everything, I mean, the old Orange State, if you want to call it that way, is gone. And the future's in our hands. It's up. In fact, the British government said, if you want a united Ireland, you've got to, if you agree to it, if that's what you want, and the Irish government will facilitate it. That's what the Irish government. I think the Irish government's a bit reluctant about that.
Aye.
But I mean, it's a very important progress, and I don't think we should minimise it. And I think I would be optimistic about the future, but there's going to be difficult decisions. I mean, the system, this mandatory coalition, it's like two parties sort of controlling the whole system and working it to their own benefit, which is a bit like replacing one party control to two-party control. So there's a whole lot of things have to change, but we're on the road, and politics is messy. As you know, all politics is messy. And I think we've made amazing progress. I mean, I also think, I've thought from a long time, as Matt was talking about the personal thing, the personal thing's so important. You may not be able to change the world, but you can change your own relationships. And you start to get to understand and respect other people's views. That's freedom, to my mind.
Gentlemen, you make us all proud of our Irish heritage. I'm curious as to just how extensive and real is the threat today of real and continuity, IRA? And then secondly, with the return of policing and justice to the island, how do you foresee the evolution of the court system, and where do you anticipate we go from there?
Do you mind if I come in on that first? You know, part of the problem is, let me address the court system first. Part of the problem is that there's still emergency legislation on the books, okay, Prevention of Terrorism Act specifically. And I have a major problem with that, because the bottom line is when you retain emergency legislation on the books, it actually acts as a Damoclean sword. It's always hanging over your head, and you don't know when it's going to be reinstituted, reused. It's like the old Special Powers Act. So I have a problem with that. I think that type of legislation is going to have to be addressed. And actually, frankly, that's also going to have to be addressed in the south of Ireland as well, because what gets lost in the shuffle is that a lot of the, and I call it repressive legislation, and the Special Powers Act, the Emergency Provisions Act, and then most lately the Prevention of Terrorism Act, they were married along the way in the Offences Against the State Act in the south of Ireland. So there's business to be done in the south of Ireland, and actually one of the things that I lament, frankly, is that there's not some sort of a representative from the southern political establishment participating in this dialogue here today, because again, I keep coming back to that's a story that is not being told.
Just on the dissidents, the CIRA and the RIRA and some Ogland Ireland and so on, I was engaged in for a number of, over a year or two, about 10 years ago, with the sovereignty movement, which is sort of linked with the real IRA. And it seemed to me that what their alternative is to go back to squabbling over United Ireland or not United Ireland. They want Irish independence, United Ireland, and they're not prepared to have any sort of negotiation over that. To my mind, the way forward has to be agreement, and agreed Ireland, and working together. Otherwise, you go back, and we haven't seen anything yet. You know, if we were to go in their direction, it's a recipe for war. They're not very large. They don't have many policies. They're not prepared even to engage. Recently, I tried to reinstitute some sort of negotiations, or not negotiations, but dialogue with them. They won't talk. They say, yes, we'll always talk, but they don't do it. And so they've isolated themselves to a large extent. They're bitter opponents of Sinn Féin. In fact, one of their gripes was that Sinn Féin wasn't taking them seriously. That's what they told us. And they actually wanted new mediators between themselves and Sinn Féin, but Sinn Féin said no. But you can understand why, you know, because there's just no give. It's just sort of black and white to them.
Yeah. I think that's the problem with the dissidents, that by and large the dissidents really go on the basis that they know what they're against, but the only thing that they can say they're for is some kind of an ideal, but they don't really have any way of actually translating that into any kind of reality. You ask about their threat, and I think that there is a threat. I can't see that it would ever develop into the kind of threat that the provisional movement posed down through its existence, because largely they're localised. In fact, the only place they're really active at the moment is probably Derry City. They certainly have the capacity to cause upset if they get to use the word facetiously, lucky. They could certainly cause large-scale injury and death. But the reality is that they don't really have any proper support at the moment. There's a certain degree of sympathy that attaches to them from certain quarters, because there is a certain degree of disillusionment with politics and politicians generally. And I keep coming back to my point about the benefit for the ordinary people. That a lot of people's lives in the last 12 years haven't really changed, and in some ways with the economic downturn, a lot of people's lives are now worse off. But those people are now looking at major Sinn Féin, major IRA leaders like Martin McGuinness, people like Jerry Kelly, and now look at them, see them very well dressed, not losing any weight anymore, and sitting in well-paid jobs with guaranteed pensions. And there's a certain disconnect there, that these guys have done all right, but they've kind of left us behind. And the dissidents are tapping into that. But I don't see them ever becoming a widespread movement again, unless somebody somewhere commits some kind of a major atrocity to bring public support behind them. You mentioned the court system, and I'm not a criminal lawyer. My main area is in property and commercial and that. There is emergency legislation still on the books. I don't think anybody really suggests that it's a major source of oppression anymore. The court system and certainly the judiciary has changed in personnel. Whether you consider that they've changed in outlook anymore is another matter, because there's no doubt about it that there are a significant number of Catholic judges, which wouldn't have been the case 20 or 30 years ago. And in fact, the present Lord Chief Justice is a Catholic. In fact, it's the second Catholic in a row to hold the post of Lord Chief Justice. And coincidentally, he's also an ex-pupil of St. Colum's College, where we came from.
Hooray for St. Colum's. Hey, the point I was going to make about the dissidents is that I think they've got the capacity to, in broad terms, to fray the edge of the peace process fabric. I think that's ultimately what their capacity is. I don't think it's going to go beyond that. However, something that Kevin said actually does make an interesting point, and it raises the question, maybe Sinn Féin should be more sensitive to that idea, should be more sensitive to responding to their criticism that they're leaving their own people behind.
Yeah. I don't think they even realise that they're doing it. There's nothing conscious
right,
about what
right.
the Sinn Féin leadership's doing. I know a lot of them, and they're very, very committed and very dedicated people. And I think they probably would be horrified in some ways if
right.
they really realised that people were now beginning to think of them like that. So, as you say, it's maybe just an unconscious lack of sensitivity.
Kevin, it's one of the, and it actually goes to the heart of one of the points that you made to me in conversation, that somehow or other Sinn Féin has been about the business of taking over the role of the SDLP, more SDLP than the SDLP themselves. Now, I know policy-wise, politically, that's clearly not the case, but for disaffected young people in particular, that's perhaps the way that they might be seeing it. And I think, it's not, I'm not about the business of telling Sinn Féin what they do. I'm here in the United States. That's not what I'm about. But it does raise the question, maybe they should be more sensitive to perception.
It should be said that Loyalist working class people feel exactly the same.
Yeah.
It hasn't, in fact, or some of them anyway, that it hasn't trickled down to them, and they feel
Right.
what's so great about the Good Friday Agreement? It benefits the politicians.
That's right. No, there's no doubt. It's the same on both sides. Yeah, that's something that it has actually managed to unite us on.
I hate to cut this off because it is absolutely fascinating, but we are 15 minutes over the time that we thought. So what we'll do is we'll take a break from now till 11. Please be here right at 11. We'll start our next panel then. And before you go, please join me once again in thanking our panelists.